right. So first and foremost, thanks for the opportunity to come chat with you guys today about some of my research. So this is some work that Kathleen and Knight and I have been working on over the past decade or two. So I'm going to kind of cover some impacts and management of emerald ash borer from tree level responses to forest dynamics and opportunities for risk management and mitigation. So I'll quickly give you an outline. We'll walk through some intro to forest disturbances, discuss some background on emerald ash borer, provide a primer on ash trees themselves, and then talk about some of the tree level impacts, and then patterns of decline across Ohio and the Allegheny National Forest. And then I'll get into some mitigation opportunities, and then wrap it up with some conclusions and future research. So I'm sure you guys know, but disturbances are pretty ubiquitous across forest ecosystems. So they vary in type. From wind throw here on the bottom left to forest fire in the bottom center, or just a small gap on the bottom right. And you can see from the map here that these biotic disturbances kind of ebb and flow across space and time, but are pretty encompassing of most of the temperate forests of the eastern United States. So biotic invasions have become commonplace because of human-mediated transport, and so we're getting about 2 to 3 invasive insects every year into the United States. And despite the kind of presence and the ubiquity of these invasive insects, there's little known about the large scale impacts on the environment. And that really limits our ability. That limits our ability to predict and mitigate their impacts on the environment. So some of the stuff that I came from a forest ecology lab at Ohio State studying forest carbon dynamics, and I was kind of interested in placing that into a disturbance setting here. And so when I started my PhD work, emerald ash borer had kind of moved in. And so emerald ash borer here is a tree boring beetle, which was accidentally introduced into southeastern Michigan from Asia in the 1990s and first discovered in the early 2000s. And it predominantly feeds on ash trees, but also white fringe tree here in the eastern U.S. And so you can see here that here's a fully formed adult bug on the top right, and some serpentine galleries in the bottom center panel. So that's kind of the primary kind of disturbance component for ash trees. There's over 40 species of ash, 20 in North America. They're characterized by this opposite branching compound leaves and winged samaras. And generically, ash are early to mid-successional species, so they're really tolerant of a variety of habitats. You can see here this image on the right. Are some ash trees here inundated, with 2 feet of water here in the spring. And so these are pretty common. They're common components in riparian systems. So green ash, white ash, and black ash are the most prominent here in the eastern United States and the Midwest. And so at the tree level here, these emerald ash borer larval densities are really correlated with decline in canopy health. And so we've kind of adapted and utilized this really generic kind of 1 to 5 canopy classification scale, with a 1 being a healthy tree and a 5 being a dead tree. And so you can see here on the right, as we get more and more emerald ash borer per meter squared in a tree, we get more and more gallery cover, and that leads to progressive mortality. So you can see here in the middle, is a completely kind of the phloem and the xylem of this tree are pretty much completely skeletonized with the serpentine galleries, and this tree is totally dead. So this progressive emerald ash borer stress results in reduced tree level water consumption. So you can see here a healthy tree is using significant amounts of water relative to a tree in pretty further stages of decline. So we rigged up some sap flux probes and tracked water use over the course of a summer. And obviously that the responsiveness of this water use characteristic is kind of contingent on solar radiation, but this has really large scale ramifications for ecosystems in general, and for kind of water exportive systems. And so these were like wicks on the landscape, using a lot of water, and subsequently these systems are becoming inundated, and many of them are even shifting over to kind of wetland systems. And so there's kind of a large scale concern that a lot of these systems are going to be pretty heavily impacted, and may shift over from timber. So EAB pressure generally results in pretty rapid tree mortality. So we get trees that die in about 2 to 5 years. And then here, this figure on the right is kind of at the stand level. So it represents the percent of ash trees that are alive in the stand in the years since infestation. And more or less, most of these sites are kind of losing ash in about 4 to 7 years, and so pretty quickly. So mortality is contingent in part on the initial ash canopy health, the crown class, site conditions and density, and we observed a small dilution effect in high density ash sites, prolonging survival. So one of the things that folks have to watch out for and managers have to be aware of associated with this, not surprisingly, these trees come down pretty quickly. And so this represents a pretty significant kind of management concern for large scale land management and municipal entities. And so they're much safer to move or remove when they're alive as opposed to dead. But we're seeing about 80% of these trees coming down in 6 to 9 years. And so a lot of this material is going to end up, in river systems and kind of downstream. And so it's kind of, one of those things folks need to be cognizant of, as far as managing, impacted systems. So at the county level detections here, you can see it was imported into the Michigan area. So we get mortal or kind of presence of EAB kind of radiating out from Detroit across these waves. And so here's kind of our observations from 2002 to 2021. And we've already got emerald ash borer in Denver and Colorado. So it's kind of it's going to continue to be an issue here in the region for quite some time. It's just getting up to the black ash swamps, or sorry, the headwaters of the Mississippi up here in northern Minnesota as well. And there's about 3/4 of a billion ash trees, black ash trees up there as well. But a lot of those systems are really susceptible to ash decline because their elevation is pretty low as is. So it's one of the concerns they're going to have to look out for. So what we've done here in Ohio is we've tracked over 3,000 ash trees individually and 6,000 total trees from 2025 or 2005 to 2021. This covers 5 different ash species and a range of densities and habitats. And so you can see here early on when we started to put some canopy traps up and trap EAB in general, but also kind of formally analyze some of this data. We had a lot of decline in mortality up in the Toledo region near the epicenter, a little bit of some pockets here in Cincinnati associated with some long distance transport, but generally speaking, some healthy trees, across the state. As time goes on, we see general decline in ash across the state. So, generally speaking, EAB has ripped through Ohio at this stage and caused pretty massive decline. And naturally, most of the Midwest states are in the same boat. So Illinois is there as well. Um, by 2019, we've had fewer than 3% of the ash trees that we've monitored on Ohio plots survive. So the survivors exhibited considerable variability with some healthy trees as well as many in decline. And so we've observed a lot of differences in the survival rate between species, with blue, green, and pumpkin ash holding up better than white and black ash. And you can see that post disturbance here, this is just kind of um, a quick graph of the diameter class of the trees and then the abundance of trees, and you can see we've lost a lot of our large diameter classes, and these would be the material that we're interested for kind of breeding purposes, because the large survivors on the landscape might have some sort of tolerance mechanisms that we need to dive into. And that's the breeding work that I'll kind of loosely cover later. Isn't really work that I lead myself, but that's work that Jennifer Cook and her team lead from the Forest Service here in Delaware, Ohio. So one of the things we've been interested to, accidentally skipping ahead, is kind of assessing these residual tree responses. So as a part of this larger study, we measured annual increment growth in non-ash trees that are greater than 10 centimeters diameter across 99 permanent plots in Toledo, Ohio. And so as kind of expected here in the bottom left, our results indicate this significant positive relationship between relative growth rate and the disturbance severity, right? So disturbance severity is basal area of ash, relative growth rate, more ash, decline, higher growth. And that's generally speaking a water, nutrient, light kind of availability issue. And so maples and elms, have exhibited the most rapid growth following this EAB disturbance. But something to think about too is that a lot of the species the genuses that you see here are kind of subjected to their own pests and pathogens, and so that's kind of something we need to think about as far as restoration of these systems. And I'll try to cover that in a little bit detail later on. But some of the other impacts that we've seen here are significant declines in above ground net primary product productivity or production associated with emerald ash borer decline. And so, we did some modeling exercises here where we looked at basically ash mortality in Toledo and Cleveland, and we did some modeling endeavors to kind of model growth of these systems, absent EAB. And what we really found was that, despite the compensatory growth of the non-ash, the loss of ash really reduced the net primary productivity of these systems by over 31%, so pretty significant. And the severity of this reduction in NPP was nonlinear and related to the basal area of ash in a stand. And so we can see that, so one of the things to really be concerned about here as far as disturbance severity is when you get up into this kind of 60%, 60 to 80% decline or disturbance severity kind of threshold, things become nonlinear. And it's kind of a really big problem because resilience of these systems is going to fall out pretty quickly at that stage. So, what are the basic implications for management that we can kind of untangle from some of our observations of the EAB waves and mortality? Is generally speaking that ash mortality follows a predictable pattern, allowing for planning and management actions. So you've got 2 to 5 years to consider health of a tree. You've got 4 to 7 years to consider health of a forest. Some of the early thinning and silvicultural actions were unlikely to slow mortality during the first wave. And these ash trees become really brittle and fall rapidly, causing a pulse of coarse woody debris. And so it's easier to cut them early, and planning is important. So next, I'm going to walk you guys through some of the emerald ash borer population dynamics, and then I'll do that in lockstep with ash mortality and stand mortality. And so I'm going to focus on 3 different sites here: Wildwood, Stratford, and Darby. One is early, or one is going to be one we initiate. The Wildwood site is going to be one we initiated kind of when EAB was already present, and Stratford and Darby are a little bit different. So we'll point those out as we go. So you can see here in Darby, early on in the infestation, we've got, ash are totally healthy and then start to decline by 2014. And you can see we get a ramp up of emerald ash borer in lockstep with the decline. As we flip to, a later, point in the dynamics at another site at Stratford Ecological Center, we see that the emerald ash borer populations here peak and as the EAB populations peak, rather, this purple line, ash mortality starts to kick in and starts to kind of, we lose ash from the forest there. And so you can see here in 4 to 5 years, the ash is totally gone from this system. So when we zoom out to the state level, we see that, if we look at the pattern in Toledo here, near the epicenter, we see the crash in emerald ash borer populations. And then we see, they kind of flatten out here, but then we get a little uptick, and so that's associated with seedling recruitment into the understory, and kind of persistence of the pest in that system. We see the, kind of that leg push out here in central Ohio, where we see a quick pulse in emerald ash borer population numbers. Again, that flattening out and then an uptick later on. So one of the things to just be aware of is that, obviously emerald ash borer, these results kind of indicate EAB is able to persist in these systems. And so one of the things we don't really know is how we enter this next phase as ash as ash is recruited, whether or not, EAB is going to persist as a secondary forest pest as it does in its home range, or if it's going to continue to eradicate the species. So where do we go from here? We've got a couple mitigation options. We can use insecticides. We can tinker with some biological controls, or we could undertake some breeding opportunities and selective breeding, or we can, kind of simultaneously conduct some restoration activities. So there's a lot of different insecticide options for individual treatment of ash trees. And so I'm not going to get into the litany of them writ whole, but there's this really great fact sheet here from Ohio State, Michigan State and Purdue, that kind of gives some of the different kind of active ingredients, application methods, and recommended timing. Generally speaking, though, most of the insecticides need to be kind of deployed early to mid-spring, and then, generally speaking, following leaf expansion. But, and that's to get the larvae that are, kind of in the tree, as well as to get the compound of the leaves to take out the adults. So, one of the ones that we've used is this emamectin benzoate. And so we use it every 2 to 3 years early on. You can use it 3 years before emerald ash borer really flares up in a site. Once it really flares up, you probably want to kick it to 2 years. And so that's a basal injection. And sadly necessitates some specialized treatment in some capacity. But all of these compounds are pretty effective, generally speaking, and so there's certainly a lot of literature out there on the success of those. Again, too, we want to be really cognizant of when we deploy these compounds. Once we get to 50% canopy thinning, nothing's going to bring these trees back. So you want to deploy these compounds before you get significant thinning in the canopy. You're going to have much better success with it. So we ran a really quick study here in Columbus where we deployed insecticides to control. It was actually in a subset of a larger experiment to control, emerald ash borer at the tree level. And basically, what we found there is kind of supports those suggestions that in these trees that start in this ash canopy condition 4, so pretty heavily impacted, most of them die. Almost all of them die. Likewise, things that start at a 3, pretty heavily thinned canopy. Things kind of stabilize, but they tend to decline. Things that are initiated at the healthier levels, so in these canopy 1 and 2 conditions, things stabilize and tend to remain pretty good following insecticide use. So one of the places we've deployed this then at the landscape is on the Allegheny National Forest. So we've got a big partnership there where we've deployed 182 permanent plots back in 2010. We looked at ash canopy condition of these sites, generally speaking, mixed initial canopy health. And the Allegheny National Forest kind of approached us to help develop an in situ conservation strategy to preserve ash across the forest. So, really progressive kind of approach there. And so, in lockstep with, kind of understanding decline patterns across the forest, we sought to kind of assess genetic diversity of ash across the forest to help provide some insights for optimizing the insecticide treatments. Because one of the things to remember is the emamectin benzoate injections get really expensive. So at the tree level, it's $80 to $150 a tree to kind of treat that. And so, and because they have to be treated every 2 to 3 years, it can become a pretty expensive endeavor. And so you want to set forth on these things not haphazardly and make sure that you're kind of undertaking things in an optimal way in some capacity. So what we did, we sampled material from across these sites on the Allegheny National Forest. I think we got like 20 to 30 trees per site. And we found that more or less the insecticide treatments that we deployed, we actually treated 27 plots across the national forest. But that was overkill. The 27 plots conserved 97% of the genetic diversity on the forest, which was pretty great. And to get the biggest bang for the buck, you could hit 10 trees per site and focus on more treatment sites as opposed to doing more trees per site. And it's possible to save reasonably significant, cost, or to confer some cost savings on this. So, despite the cost of the analyses, even including the analyses, you could save upwards of 20% of the you could save 20% by optimizing the treatments. And so that's even after paying for the cost of the analyses. So the way that we also kind of layered into this insecticide study, an associational protection study. And so here's an example of how we set that up. Within each of these 27 plots, they're 7 hectare plots, 100-meter radius plots. We identified all the ash trees in the plot and randomly selected like 20 of them to get treated with insecticide and the remainders not to get treated. So here's a plot with 26 trees. The blue ones were treated, the 6 ones were left untreated. And we were kind of looking at the ability to confer some associational protection from the insecticide treatment onto the non-treated trees. And so we were kind of looking at thresholds in that. And this is kind of an ongoing study, but I can kind of give you guys a glimpse at some of the data we're seeing. So in the background here from 2010 to 2021, we've seen, generally speaking, across the landscape, the standard patterns that we expected. Generally, ash is dying from these systems. And what we found when we conducted our associational protection study is that the treated trees, as expected, this green line here on the bottom, the treated trees remain pretty healthy. Here's the untreated trees, or this red bar up here, and you can see that the untreated trees, as expected, decline pretty significantly. And kind of this is we're really interested to see how long this associational protection kind of component holds. But these are untreated trees. This yellow line here are untreated trees in treated plots. And so you can see that these are really holding on, and this insecticide protection, is kind of conferring a benefit on these untreated trees, because otherwise this yellow line would be all the way up here in the where the red ones are. And so some of the insights there from the insecticide management is that, insecticide treatments can protect trees. These treatments work better when the trees are healthy, and untreated trees may get some protection from being near these treated trees. But treatment results may vary depending on the tree's environment themselves. So EAB biocontrol is also, kind of ongoing right now. And so there's three different species, generally speaking, or three different genera that they're using. They're using this Oobius, that's an egg parasitoid, a Tetrasticus, which is an internal EAB larval parasitoid, and some Spathius that are external EAB larval parasitoids. And so these are all kind of native parasitoids that are brought in from these different Asian origins, and have been distributed across the eastern United States, based on land management requests. And so here's kind of a map of the MAP biocontrol EAB parasitoid releases across the eastern U.S. This was kind of an earlier map, so there's probably more dots on the map by now. But early studies from China suggest that the parasitism by Oobius and Tetrasticus result in about 74% population reduction in green ash in China. And so we get parasitism rates of 36% of Oobius and 23% of Tetrasticus writ whole. But these EAB parasitoid recoveries in North America have been successful. So, the recovery is considered, success of the program in some capacity when they put the material out and they can get it years into the future. That's naturalization of the material, or the parasitoid. And they've been tracking the parasitism here, since they've deployed them, and they've had really good success with that. So, hopefully it can help, when paired with restoration, breeding purposes, and kind of, some other mitigation attempts can help maintain ash as a component of the forest. So next, I'm going to cover some work here spearheaded by Dr. Jennifer Cook, with the Forest Service in Delaware, Ohio, where she looks at native ash species which vary in susceptibility to ash. And she's doing some ash breeding work right whole. She doesn't really work on blue ash, which has been observed to be more resistant than white, green, and black ash. And so she's been really looking at, resistant native trees that survive this first EAB invasion. She's focused primarily on, I think green and black ash for her first kind of foray into this. But this long-term research is underway to identify resistance genes and develop resistant ash trees for North America. And so, quick background on this: natural stands have lots of genetic variability, right? And so this is the basis for tree improvement programs since the 1950s. These rare alleles can confer resistance or partial resistance without coevolutionary history, and they can be rare because there's no selective advantage prior to a disturbance threat. So following the introduction of an invasive pest, the trees with highest susceptibility to die first, and the remaining trees resistant, and some are susceptible. So the proportion of resistant trees in the next cohort's greater, and there are more opportunities for the resistant trees to breed with each other. So these breeding programs kind of identify and preserve this valuable material, and they hopefully push and perpetuate the beneficial traits to the next generations. So here's just kind of a graphical step through of that natural selection component, where we're culling out these susceptible trees over time. That's what our pest is doing. We're leaving these resistant trees into the next generation. And some of the susceptibles might squeak through too. But over time, we're going to get perpetuation of the resistance genes. So the breeding allows us to be able to combine the best genes from each parent. So we might be able to take the trees that exhibit the best growth inhibition of emerald ash borer, and we might be able to cross those that have the highest larval kill, right? And so over time, we're able to create, we're able to stack systems with these different genes, and kind of we can further improve this selection with each generation. So we're planting out the best second generation trees in seed orchards. And we're also kind of loosely conducting these, not loosely, we're conducting these activities with American elm as well. And so some of the egg bioassays or results that Jennifer has here is basically what she's doing is she takes these emerald ash borer larvae, or these emerald ash borer eggs rather. She deposits them with on coffee filters onto the trees, and they kind of track the serpentine galleries and the survival of the larvae themselves. So here is a larvae that's killed by a host. Another one is a healthy larvae that didn't die. And so here we can take two different lingering ash parents, and just kind of for comparative purposes, we'll have a susceptible control where everything dies, or we have a Manchurian ash which is pretty successful at host killing. Um, and sorry, not everything dies. That's the larvae in the tree kind of mature to an L3 or an L4 size. Sorry, so it doesn't really kill any of the larvae. Um, so you can see in our two lingering ash parents, we've got a lot of larval growth here, but we also have a lot of host kill. And so we take two trees with differential host kill, but higher than your average. We cross those and we get a handful of different progeny. Some that are worse than the parents, some that are like the parents, and a bunch that are better than the parents. And you can see some of these that are better than the parents are really, really good, right? We get, upwards of 70%, 75% host kill in some of these. So, this breeding program really has legs for this. And, this isn't going to be, a silver bullet for the environment, but it's certainly going to be a step in the right direction to get us closer to kind of preserving these systems and the genus itself. So another tool that managers need to be aware of and kind of utilize, and obviously, folks are doing this a great job at this all over the place, but is restoration, right? And so results from our permanent EAB plots kind of indicate that there's really rapid radial growth of residual trees in tandem with ash decline. And so here, if we look at ash canopy condition, this gray stippled line. So from Toledo here, we go from reasonably healthy ash canopy conditions of 1 all the way up to dead conditions, 5 years later. In tandem with that, we've got this really, whether or not these trees were suppressed or co-dominant, doesn't really matter. They still both get a growth bump associated with the decline of ash. And so, some of the implications of this are plant early and capitalize on these gaps as they're kind of opening. And by planting early too, we can maintain the ecosystem function and ensure that these systems don't slip into shrub dominated systems. And so, since ash, frequently occurs in ecologically sensitive forests, it's really important to maintain that function. And so we've got some different experiments, across the eastern U.S. that are doing this, and we've kind of been working to select trees and species that kind of will fill different structural components of these gaps. And so we're looking for understory, mid canopy, and canopy trees. And one of the species we're using for this is American elm. And so it's not surprising that we're losing ash here. But ash gained its dominance, generally speaking, in lockstep with the decline of American elm, right? And so these riparian systems in the eastern United States are really sensitive systems. They're not terribly speciose. The material in them needs to be tolerant of seasonal flooding, inundation, and there's just not really a lot of species here that can do that. So really, we're stuck with maples, elms, and ash, and obviously, elm gets Dutch elm disease. Maple is kind of threatened by Asian longhorn beetle and some other pathogens, and obviously ash is on its way out. So it's really important that we think about how we want to manage these systems right whole. So quickly, I can wrap up some of these conclusions and implications for management. Ash is a really widespread foundational species, critical to a myriad of important forest ecosystems. EAB is impacting and will continue to impact these forests across the eastern U.S. The progressions and patterns of mortality are predictable, allowing for planning and management. Removal and silvicultural efforts have generally proven ineffective at meaningfully slowing the spread. Integrated pest management frameworks combining different science-based strategies may be most effective at preserving the genera as well as maintaining ecosystem function. And certainly, the myriad of mitigation options, including insecticides, biocontrol, and effective breeding, is going to be really, really significant in this. Um, and then tree planting, obviously, in sensitive ecosystems can help maintain function following the decline. So, without further ado, I'd like to, kind of acknowledge my long list of research collaborators here and partners. Without the collaborators and the Metro Park buy-in, we wouldn't be able to conduct most of this work. So it's really a testament to a large team effort. And without further ado, I can address some questions if you guys have them.